Okay, yes, well, before hearing about the Skeptics, I was running a bit of a campaign against various psychics in the media. I was an engineer and studied physics, and I was concerned about the distraction that this was causing. So Kevin Arnett was one of the early writers with a psychic column in, was it People's Magazine, something like that? And I wrote to him and criticising some of his predictions, said, some of us take notes about your psychic's predictions, and here's a list of the ones that didn't come to pass. And he wrote back, actually responded to me, telling me how wrong I was. So shortly after that, about 1980, Dick Smith held his water divining tests, which I saw on TV, and they said that they were thinking of starting a Skeptics group. So a few months later, I contacted that Skeptics group, and they did a bit of due diligence on me to make sure I wasn't a plant, and got into the group then. I think it was late 1980.
So you contacted Mark Plummer?
Yes.
Right.
I did indeed, and James Durand were the main ones then.
But how did you know about them?
There was an article in the paper saying they were setting up a Skeptics group, and interested people could...
Do you remember what paper that was?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But it was connected with the water divining tests, the article. Well, I went to visit them, and they said they'd done some checks on me, and I wasn't a plant,
yes,
and would I like to join their committee. I showed them some of the letters I'd written already, which backed it up a bit, and I fell straight into it then.
Right.
So on the committee then there was James Durand. We met at his house in, I think it was Hawthorne, and Mark Plummer, and Joe Rubenstein, and Dr. Alan Christophers, and a few other people. I think Peter Hogan might have been on the scene then too. And the magazine, I remember sitting there cutting out bits of paper and using glue stick material to put them into the master copy, which had all these edges around where the cut and paste had occurred, and you tried to photocopy that to send out in a way that didn't show the edges too much, and then you had to staple them all in together in the middle with a long arm stapler. So that was the mechanisms of producing the Skeptic magazine in the early days.
So you were instrumental from the very early days in actually creating the magazine itself.
Yes, and wow. we bought a photocopier. That was our major asset. We were worried about being sued because we might lose our photocopier. And that used to sit there and run for hours producing the copies of the magazine, which we then had to collate and staple and envelope and send out.
That's interesting. I didn't know it was that. I don't want to use the word primitive, but I didn't know it happened in that exact fashion.
And it was actually an IBM golf ball typewriter that printed it out. And we had two golf balls, one with the little font and one with the big font for headings and things. And as I recall, the bigger headlines, some of them were done using Letraset. Some of you might remember Letraset. It's like a sheet of clear material with black lettering on them, and you could rub the letter onto the page to set up your headlines. So that was quite something. I was investigating things with a scientific bent, as I still am now. At the time I was on the committee of the Inventors Association of Victoria, and there were quite a few dubious people came up with inventions which they tried to promote at exhibitions which I used to run. So I was concerned about this, so I brought their attention to the Skeptics and wrote a few articles investigating some of these inventions, and had some of them not quite kicked out, but derated from the Inventors Association, things that weren't real.
Right. So in those early days, how often would you meet as a committee? Once a month or more frequently?
Yes, once a month.
Once a month.
Yeah. And they were quite serious and business-like meetings too. There was no drinks at the meetings. Well, there still isn't, but because we've got serious business to do. But it was all very pleasant, and everyone felt they were making a difference to society. Okay, well, one of the big investigations we did was the water-powered car designed by Stephen Horvath in Queensland and promoted by the then Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen, whom some of you might remember. And he was in the media pouring water from a jug into the petrol filler of his car and then going to drive away, only to discover he didn't have the keys with him. So, so I did a big investigation of that. He claimed to have patents on the subject, so I tracked down his patents and found out that the patents were not related to a car running on water. Surprise, surprise. Published the patents, well, extracts therefrom, in the Skeptic magazine, and described how A, it couldn't work from a theoretical basis, and B, the patent was irrelevant, and C, no one had witnessed him driving this car, verifying that it was on water. So that was a major investigation. There was a psychic dentist who toured Australia from the USA, and his claim that he would provide surgery on your teeth and he would turn your amalgam fillings into gold. Guaranteed. So he's performed surgery on a lot of people in Melbourne, and the Skeptics protested against him. And then finally, it was discovered that he was telling the people, when he was holding public days to get them to come and promote his idea, that it would take 2 weeks for them to turn into gold. It wouldn't be instantaneous like he'd been suggesting before. And of course, within 2 weeks he'd done the surgery and was out of the country. It's very convenient. Another one was a psychic called Hassel, who said that he would appear on stage and would disappear in front of your very eyes. So he was claiming that you could see right through him. So the Skeptics went along and watched it and found out that all he was doing was slipping between two curtains from the light into the dark. So he did indeed disappear. So the Skeptics wrote an article saying we did concede that we could indeed see right through him. So there was a touch of humour as well. There was the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works in the early days. They hired a psychic from the USA, at least she came from the USA of her own accord, and then she proceeded to divine psychic buildings. In other words, she could find historical building sites around Melbourne with a divining rod. So she'd be driven around there with officials from the government, divining them, putting pegs in the ground, saying, here's where an ancient building was, and here's a sketch of the building. And they were paying her money for this, ratepayers' money. At the end of the day, we had a look at her sketches, and they were all of American-style buildings. So much for the colonial Australian buildings that she was finding. Another physics event was a psychic called Byron Rigby, who ran the Transcendental Meditation Group, all sorts of yoga. He was also a mathematics professor somewhere, and he was claiming that he could levitate. He had pictures to prove it, of he and his students floating above a mattress in mid-air, maybe 2 feet above the mattress. And we were very skeptical of this, so we investigated that and he was unable to produce any evidence whatsoever that he could levitate. Some of his students said that, okay, if you sit cross-legged on a mattress, you can actually bounce up and down, a bit like on a trampoline. And they'd taken photographs when he was at the apogee of his trajectories. So it looked like he was floating in air. The Creation Science Foundation from Queensland went around Australia holding conferences to promote creationism. And they had found a guy who claimed to have scientific evidence that the speed of light was slowing down. Now, why was this important? Because if the speed of light was faster in the past, it would overcome the objection that light from distant galaxies takes billions of years to reach us. So how could it be that the universe was only 6,000 years old? Well, his thesis showed, his claim, that the speed of light was much higher in the past, so it could travel all that distance, like 1 billion light years, in only 6,000 years, and the Bible could be true after all. So I gathered some data on his measurements. He published a thing called a monograph, which I think is a self-published scientific paper on that topic. So I took his data and found out the source data and wrote a little paper showing that he had selected his data. And the evidence that the speed of light was slowing down was achieved simply by selecting the earlier measurements which were less accurate, the higher ones in their range, and the current ones low evidence in their range, which showed it slowing down by 1 or 2%. in the last 100 years. So I went to the creation conference to heckle. Now I've taken several different lines of action against psychics and charlatans. The best thinking is that you go along and you observe and you report. Well, that might be okay, but it's not very satisfying on the day. So you can ask questions at the end. But if I find there's skeptics in the audience, then the question period vanishes altogether or becomes very short. So the only option is to maybe stand outside and speak to people, or sometimes you can heckle. So I don't often do it, but I have been known to heckle or to interject with a question when it's really needed. And if that doesn't work, another way is to simply give a belly laugh, which I find very effective as well. So anyway, Barry Setterfield was at the front of the conference reading out his paper that the speed of light has slowed down and Genesis could be right. And then the light bulb on his podium that he was reading on his lectern, reading his paper from, went out. So they hunted around trying to find a torch for him to read his notes by. So I yelled out, "Looks like the speed of light is slowing down as we speak." So that's the sort of way one can perhaps get publicity. Your psychic surgery is something that we were involved in the 1980s as well. As you know, that's where a surgeon, so-called surgeon, probably from the Philippines, pretends to do an operation on a person and pretends to remove some innards from them and declare them cured and zip up their stomach again so there's no evidence. Well, as Tim described, we gave a demonstration of that at a convention in Sydney, which showed how it could be done. And then there's a magazine called Australian Playboy who said they'd like to do an article on it, and did we have some photographs of psychic surgery being performed. They weren't happy with... Sorry?
Did they have their clothes on?
We didn't have our photographs they weren't happy with, so they said, well, we're a bit flexible here, perhaps you can have some tomorrow. You can create some. So I was given the task of doing some fake psychic surgery by the Skeptics to provide them with photographs which we were led to believe they would then publish as the Skeptics showing how psychic surgery can be done. So I started to do some psychic surgery on a Melbourne committee member, Joe Rubinstein, and he was as skinny as a rake. So do you think I could create an appropriate fold of fat on his stomach to get my hands inside? No way, I couldn't do it. So we decided Mark Plummer was better endowed with a layer of body fat, and I did the surgery on him, producing chicken guts from the incision and with appropriate guidance from magicians and so forth. So that was carefully filmed by Australian Penthouse magazine and was published in the magazine. But the problem is they forgot that it was done by Australian Skeptics, and they said it was photographs of psychic surgery being performed in the Philippines. So my hands, I can say that I'm a hand model for Australian Penthouse magazine, and I was published there doing this psychic surgery, but not given credit for it because the credit was given to the real psychic surgeons, so-called.
So that was let's just get that right. It was Penthouse or Playboy? Because at the beginning
it was
you said
Australian Penthouse.
It was Penthouse, okay.
It's the Steve Turbo hoax, which was organised partly by the Australian Skeptics in Victoria at that time. But I wasn't in the know. There were only a small number of people who were in the know to try and keep it secret. So I saw in the media that this psychic, Steve Turbo, was coming to Australia to speak to spirits and things like that. So I decided to start my own campaign against him. So I contacted the media and tried to contact the organiser of this and decided that the phone calls I were being given didn't work, and pressed a bit harder to manage to speak to some people who were very evasive. So I brought it to the attention of the committee and said, look, there's this hoaxer coming here and I'd like to expose him, but I can't get anywhere with my inquiry. Should I keep pursuing it? And the organiser said, no, don't worry about it, Ian. Let it go. That's not important. So I wasn't in that loop. And then it all was revealed a few days later, and it was exposed. And in 1985, I got a job in Sydney in satellite communications. So then they said, well, you should make contact with the Sydney group, which I did, 1985. Moved to Sydney, went to the National Convention in Sydney, which was a major event. I remember the psychic surgery and many of the other talks. And then it was decided to move the committee to Sydney, which I think happened in the next year. So that's when I settled in with Tim and Barry and the others on the committee here. They were already active in the Skeptics in Sydney, and the Victorians had the feeling that the centre of gravity was moving northwards, especially since Mark Plummer went to the USA and was no longer producing the magazine. One of my tasks in coming to Sydney, the Skeptics Committee asked me to check out Barry Williams, whether he would be suitable for running the National Committee. So I thought that was a bit like the tail wagging the dog. But anyway, Barry proved very kind to me and gracious and a good skeptic as well. So I reported back that we should have no reservations about enlisting Barry Williams, and the rest is history. I was investigating most of the scientific things, as I still am today. And I remember in particular, of course, Barry Williams and Tim Mendham. There was also some magicians, such as Mike Wilton, on the committee then. In fact, he liked to do some stunts involving magic, such as being dunked into a river in a cage, apparently to drown, and yet he would survive, would come out of the water 5 minutes later alive and healthy. I'm trying to remember who the other committee members were. There was Jean Whittle, as Tim mentioned. I can't think who the others on the committee were.
All right, but soon after you joined, you were put into the place of being an investigator.
Indeed, yes.
And were the meetings like in Melbourne, were they once a month? And where do you remember first meeting, the location?
I think we met in the Chatswood Club. We had a room there where we could meet. And I seem to remember that we used to have drinks at the meeting then, which was a bit less formal. So if you're going to do something serious that you enjoy, you might as well have a drink. That was one view.